Hi, everyone, and welcome back to a new episode of the Sustainable Cannabis Coalition podcast, in which we talk all things sustainability with some of the most distinguished experts in the cannabis industry. I'm your host, Rodrigo Pereira, VP of Product Management at GrowIQ. Today, I'll be talking with Tony Verzura, CEO of Blue River Terps, one of the premier innovators in cannabis extraction and a founding member of the coalition. Tony will dive deep into extraction, different methods, their pros and cons, and the impact extraction processes have on sustainability in the cannabis industry. It's a fascinating conversation. You don't want to miss it. Hi, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of the Sustainable Cannabis Coalition podcast. Today, we have the absolute pleasure to welcome Tony Verzura, the CEO of Blue River Terps. And Tony's a real innovator in the cannabis space, has been doing it for over 20 years. He has over 80 cannabis awards, go with 4 cannabis patents. He's been featured multiple times in cannabis magazines, news publications, reality shows, and so the works. Tony's here today to talk with us about cannabis extraction methods. And some of the sustainability implications of that. Tony, welcome.
Thank you for having me, Rodrigo.
Tony, so just to start off and to give our listeners a little bit of your background, if you don't mind, just tell us how you got into the industry, and what led you to where you are today.
Well, my journey started, actually first cannabis experience started in the summer of 95, actually with a trip to Europe with my brothers when I was actually 16. We went from England to Italy, obviously stopped in Amsterdam, and that's where I tried my first cannabis experience with both flowers and hashish. And picked up some skunk number 1 seed. Did not realize the impact that discovery would have or the impression on me later in life. But several years later, I was in an accident and turned to cannabis for pain relief over prescribed opiates that they were trying to give me. Found cannabis to be safer, more sustainable, not have any long-term adverse effects on my health. So it was in the, I would say, late 90s when I started realizing how hard it was to actually come by any type of cannabis or quality of cannabis that I could start utilizing in my life, and kind of got into it from a trip, and then later an accident. So it was kind of maybe preordained that I was going to get into it. But I used cannabis as a patient first.
That's an incredible story, Tony, from the perspective of this is really a very personal journey for you. I mean, it obviously helped you in many ways that one may not think about initially, and I mean that's just fascinating to hear. That's really, really interesting. And Tony, if you wouldn't mind telling us a little bit more about Blue River Terps, what your mission is there, what you're up to.
Yeah. So originally, this started the concept that started around in 2014 or 2015, and it was based on a conversation of other people in the industry and where we thought the industry was going at that time. And a friend of mine had said to me, "Well, if you can figure out how to isolate terpenes or cannabis terpenes, that's the future." And that was kind of the conversation back then. And I remember asking that very question to an ex-NASA engineer in this conversation. I said, "Well, what makes it smell the way it does and taste the way it does?" And without realizing it, that was something that I really fixated on. And I didn't realize that not only is this, cannabis terpenes make up the aroma and the flavor, but it's also responsible for the effect. And so Blue River got its origins in the beginning when I started to play around with different ways to extract the cannabis terpenes from flowers. And so most people from the 2014 to 2015 time period was able to hear of Blue River because of our cannabis derived terpenes. And we did this without any solvents. And in that timeline, we helped popularize the word terps and terpenes on the globe. And then later, I started developing different solventless techniques and mechanical extractions and advanced mechanical extraction techniques to produce our own line of products. And so 2017, we kind of advanced into more products than just terpenes. But for, many years of recognition and awards that we were winning was because of the use of cannabis terpenes in the extraction process, isolation process, and as a standalone. So that was our first initial. That was my first initial impression, I guess, with Ripper. I've been in the industry for a while. My first personal company, like I put behind a brand that I was uh, started was Blue River with the terpenes.
That's just fantastic background and getting again to hear a little bit more of your story. Maybe turning quickly to sustainability. What's I guess we talk about sustainability in the cannabis industry. What does that mean to you?
So sustainability for me, it takes into a couple of accounts. Is when we're talking about sustainability in extracts, I look at what's the environmental impact on the inputs and what's the environmental impact on the output. And the reason why I look at the environmental impact first is because then it kind of leads me down to, is this a sustainable practice that A, good for the planet, and B, good for the consumer? And so I think of sustainability, I think of practices and methodologies that can minimize environmental impact, energy costs, and create products for the end consumer with the most sustainable business model possible.
Great, so I think this is a really good lead into our next question, which is I think kind of at the core to Blue River. So I wanted you to expand a little bit on the origin of solventless extraction and in general what that would mean for the industry.
So the origin of solventless name itself is what you're asking?
It's the process.
Yeah. So, well, the term solventless actually was popularized by a hash maker by the name of Piketty, a friend of mine. Solventless, in short, means to isolate or create an extract without the use of a solvent or chemical through means of mechanical method. Products that are considered solventless in our industry would be hash, dry sift, hashish, hash rosin, flower rosin, and live rosin. Some of the controversy surrounding this use of solventless is expressed by chemists or other scientists that argue that when water, the universal solvent, is used in the process, it is technically not a solventless product. I would argue, along with virtually all other hash makers on the planet, our industry would argue that water, in this case, or in some of the products that I mentioned, in those cases, is not being used to dissolve the trichome heads, but rather used as a carrier to help gently carry those tiny resin glands through a series of filter bags and that are submerged in water in order to isolate and classify them based on their gland size. What I mean by that, kind of, it's a lot to absorb, but in the 90s, there was a publication that was released to the public that basically was a pretty interesting discovery that you can take a pickle jar filled with ice and water and put your cannabis buds in it and shake it up and then real aggressively and then put it on the counter. And if you wait 5 minutes, you'll see all the trichome heads sink to the bottom of the jar. This is a pretty pivotal moment in discovery for modern day hash making. And still to this day, this concept is widely used in the industry for isolating those trichome heads in order to make the extract from those resin glands. And so, a lot of people, when they think of extract, they sometimes forget about the isolation part first. And so, solventless is, making isolating the resin glands and or making extract without the use of a solvent or chemical solvent to dissolve the buds and or those resin glands. So those are some of the product history where solventless, came from.
So that's I think that's really interesting from thinking about it in terms of process. Is there a differentiation in terms of using water versus a chemical solvent that changes the nature of the product? And I guess, is there any advantage to using water that you might win or lose by using other solvents?
Yeah. So that's in it's a loaded question. 'Cause, um, using solvents, you want the long answer for solvent based versus the non-solvent, or the short
Uh,
answer on that one?
no, let's dive deep into this. This is fantastic.
Well, let's see here. The extraction process. Let's break these things into two categories. So let's identify a few things. So isolation and extraction, I think, need to be clarified. And other hash makers that would be listening to this would agree. And just from a visual standpoint, if we took the cannabis bud and we took a microscope out, looked at the little red trichome heads that are surrounding the surface of the buds, that's what we're interested in when we're talking about hash making, and whether we're using sieves or ice water filtration methods, or heat latent pressure, or any of the CO2, ethanol, hydrocarbons, butane, propane, hexane, all these different chemical solvents. Ideally, it's two different directions. One direction is taking those buds and you're dissolving them in some form of a solvent or a gas, and then into a solvent. And that's all your solvent based. And so the other concept in the non-solvent base, or the solventless, is isolating the resin heads first. And that's what we refer to as hash or dry sieve. And then what we do with those resin heads, whether we press them, which makes hashish, or
Mhm.
rosin, we press them through filtration. And so isolating the heads is the first step in a solventless extraction process. And then what we do with the heads after that, the expression of those trichome heads, getting the oils out of those heads, would be the hash oil or the extracted oil. And so that's a significant difference between like a solventless and a solvent, because the solvent version is you're taking that bud, you're putting it into some kind of a column or a chamber, and whether you're passing CO2 gas or ethanol or any of the hydrocarbons, you're passing it through the bud. So you're essentially dissolving those resin glands along with everything else that's in the plant.
Mhm.
And so in the solvent process, they actually have a post refinement. So just kind of like in the solventless, we isolate heads and then we express them. Sort of like if we were picking grapes off of a vine and then pressing those grapes and making grape juice. That's the solventless way.
Yep.
In the solvent-based way, we're taking the whole grapevine and we're going to put it into a big barrel and fill it with ethanol, and we're going to dissolve everything in that into a juice, and then we're going to boil out the ethanol to get to a final product. And that's kind of the fundamentals of those two different worlds. But from a you can go deeper on like what the impacts are and sustainability of it, but kind of gives you an idea of the two different platforms.
Yeah, so totally. I think that's a really good explanation in terms, again, for maybe new listeners in terms of understanding that differentiation, which kind of leads me to the next question. I think you differentiated these two processes really well. So, what do you see as being the environmental impact for each type of method?
Yeah. So, all right, let's talk with the solvent based extractions first. So products that fall into solvent-based extraction. A lot of people probably heard of this. RSO, butane honey oil, um, BHO or CO2 distillate, diamond, shatter, crumble, live resin, all of those terms and extract or concentrates fall into the solvent-based extraction category. And when we talk about solvent-based extraction methods, they rely on hydrocarbons or ethanol. And let's talk with butane first. I mean, everyone can relate to that. So we're talking about butane, like BHO or any kind of distillate or diamonds or shatter or live resin. Butane is derived from a natural gas. Can also be found in petroleum.
Mm-hmm.
It has a chemical signature C410 or H10, and is considered a flammable hydrocarbon. This does have an environmental impact on producing the butane itself, and when used for cannabis extraction methods, the byproduct left behind on the cannabis buds has to be handled by a third-party hazardous waste distributor. So the process of making butane and the use of butane when it's passed through the cannabis plant material, just think about that. That means it's staining that cannabis material, and then it's rendered hazardous waste, and therefore it has to be picked up by a third party vendor and put back into the environment some condition. So there's an environmental footprint left behind on the input and the export of making BHO products.
Mm-hmm.
They also require a lot more substantial oversight on like the infrastructure in the workplace or the building in which they are being produced, because there is an explosive nature to the process. However, modern day hydrocarbon extraction methods have many safety checkpoints, and when right controlled environments is relatively safe. Ethanol is, considered a quote unquote organic solvent. It's also derived from sources like starches, including corn, wheat, grain, barley, potatoes, sugar. Most of all of the ethanol in the United States is produced primarily from corn. So there in itself also has an environmental impact on creating the actual ethanol, and it is heavily used. When we say ethanol extraction, you're soaking the plant material in a lot of ethanol.
Mm-hmm.
These ethanol producers are going through it on a large scale. And when anyone says CO2 is a solventless, CO2 gas may be, but CO2 actually acts more as a solvent than BHO, than any butane or hydrocarbon, because it's under high amounts of pressure, more
Right.
like 5,000 psi. And so what it does is it pulls out a lot of waxes and a lot of lipids and waxes, and therefore CO2 has to be winterized, which then relies back on ethanol. And there is that impact both going in and out, but one little advantage of ethanol versus butane is that a lot of these manufacturers are doing a full recovery on the ethanol. So after they're using it to be extracted and they go through their refinement process, it's kind of like boiling off the ethanol and then recapturing. So in that process, when you're thinking of ethanol, it's an organic solvent from a plant, and they're able to recapture it. So I feel like probably has a less, I don't know, to me, it's both of those categories still have a tremendous impact, environmentally speaking.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
No, absolutely. And just thinking about the kind of the further overhead or process in terms of, like you said, in terms of treating that material as hazardous waste. I mean, that I assume also kind of imposes a bit of a regulatory burden that might not exist if you weren't treating it as hazardous waste.
Yeah, a lot of people don't talk about that, right? So and that's what, with Blue River, how I ever started, I was like, I mean, think of the name, Clean Blue River.
Yeah. Yep.
Right? Like, I'm like, we all want to live in a planet that has clean air, clean water, and I actually, a lot of, half the awards I've won and a lot of the processing I did was on the hydrocarbon and ethanol side before.
Mm-hmm.
But once I found non-solvent and the use of mechanical. And believe you me, this was not the category of solventless was very difficult to make products and hit yields and to do it in any form of a business that like made any sense. And when people look into like solventless products, they tend to be more expensive than um, a solvent-based extraction method in those types of products because you're thinking of machines,
Mhm.
the labor's less. And so there's a difference in price point, just like you would go into the store and you would see freshly squeezed orange juice versus Sunny D.
Yep.
Like you pay for what you get.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
But you said it best when it's like an unadulterated version or expression. It's a real authentic, unadulterated expression of the resin glands in its purest form. And that's really what solventless is about. And the good news, talking about sustainability, and this is what really excites me, is that in the non-solvent category, we're talking about vibrating sieves, static, heat latent pressure. All of these types of products don't rely on any solvents. We're not dissolving the products. We're using different sieves and static and heat pressure plates to isolate those resin glands and produce these products. And products like that are like dry sieve, hash yeast, dry sieve, hash rosin, and flower rosin. Where it gets a little different is products that are known as ice water hash and live rosin, which is a very, live rosin is becoming very popular these days. This is where those trichome heads are being separated using ice and water agitation methods in a very cold room. And even with that, the power requirements to run these types of products is substantially lower, and the footprint in a facility is substantially lower than when we're talking about butane extraction or ethanol extraction. I mean, these things are very expensive to get going versus a non-solvent category. Um, and there's other ways that like I've developed methods to recapture water from the cultivation rooms in its atmosphere um, through the humidity that's being produced by plants. There's ways to extract that water and use that for the ice and the actual water in the extraction process. So, we're, we're at the point where we can harvest our own water from the atmosphere, which I know sounds a little bit crazy, but it is possible. And when you have enough canopy and you think about all the water that you're pulling out
Yep.
with dehumidification, this is the next level in my mind, at least, what sustainable extractions is about.
Absolutely. And as you were describing that, the impression that I get is obviously there's a lot of innovation, a lot of probably both technologically and process innovation that goes into what you're doing. So I'd just love to hear a little bit more about that in terms of technologies or methods that you've developed that supports the, I guess, the sustainable extraction methods.
Yeah. So over the years, I spent a lot of time, and people ask me like, how I get to this endpoint, and I always tell them the same thing, like trial and error and a lot of failure. Anyone you talk to that does anything substantial, if you listen to Elon Musk or anyone these days, and how do you get there? You fail a lot, and you try things over and over and over, and you spend a lot of time and money doing that. But eventually, the data, if you follow the data and you follow science and you look at all the parameters like a board, and you say, okay, whether I'm shifting or I'm using static. Like, why does the static work? What's the polarity of CO2 versus ethanol
Mhm.
versus water? And you start to dive into the science and you realize that everything has a polarity and everything has a box that it seems to fall into. And if you pull the data and you come together and you say, okay, from an isolation, from an extraction, and from a formulation, because that's really like how I start. I start on what's the problem and what's the solution. If the problem is there's no organic, authentic, unadulterated, full spectrum oil in a capsule, as an example, I say to myself, well, how can I deliver that without it? Keep that vegan, no sugar, no calories. I'm working on the solution, not the means of how to get there
Hmm.
first.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
I think a lot of people, they're inside their extraction method, or they're inside something, and there's no end goal in sight.
Right.
And so in the patents and things that I've developed, they were always based on problem versus solution. So, case in point with CBN, that was my latest patent. Like, how do I convert Delta 8, THCA, or THC into CBN without any traces of THC left? And for those that don't know why that would be very significant in the industry of both hemp and THC, it's uh, it's significantly important and interesting, because when you look at the laws and you look at say hemp as an industry, having anything over a certain percentage of THC deems it unrentable.
Yep.
And so if you're growing high CBD varieties and turning them into a concentrate, and you have 6% THC, it forces those uh, manufacturers to use like pentane and hexane to isolate CBD. They're further going down the rabbit hole of chemicals.
Hmm. Hmm.
Where if I can develop the solution of a solventless apparatus that can not rely on chemicals and convert that Delta 9 or Delta 8 into CBN, then we have a solution, and a viable solution for a tremendous amount of biomass and concentrates in the hemp sector. And then we take that into what we can do as far as a formulator. Um, Different patents that I've developed. There's methods of use utilizing chemotypes, phytocannabinoids, cannabinoids, and terpenes. And so there's a desire to have CBD, CBN, CBG, THCA, and THC, but 99% of the industry is using solvents and
Yep.
chemicals, and sometimes synthetic, to get to that. And so I always look at like I said, there's how do we get to the solution? What's the problem? And what's our obstacles? And I think that's what's kept me motivated, is the challenge of creating different types of apparatuses, methods of use, in isolating, extracting, and infusing for product without the use of chemicals. And most people, that's the path over the mountain, not through it or around it, right?
Absolutely. And Tony, now that you mentioned patents, before we talked, I took a look at some of your patents, and I just found it fascinating in terms of the precision, in terms of the formulations, and even some of the I guess usage schedules that you have in the patent literature. I just found that fascinating, coming technical background and looking at this through someone with technical eyes. It was just a really kind of very, very interesting read, and it got me thinking in terms of there seemed to be probably from your perspective novelty that wasn't out there. Um, so from that, I guess, what was the biggest differentiator for you from that perspective? What didn't you see that motivated you to develop the intellectual property?
Yeah. So, you know, I feel like we talk about the novelty of things, like, especially with there's probably two or three of them in provisional state that will start to come out. And I guess the CBN one comes out in May because it was in provisional. But I also worked on some other ones with formulas with medicinal mushrooms, things like this, um, that will come out too. And there's a lot of things that, like, when we go down this path and we look at receptor system and we say, okay, we look into the endogenous endocannabinoid system, and it's inherently part of our DNA and all living humans and animals. And sometimes expressions are different. There's different amount of receptors in each of us. Like, there's different expressions of our genes and how we look, our sizes and features. The endocannabinoid system is the same thing. You may have 10,000 receptors, have 50,000. Person may have 2,000. These receptors exist in the mind and the body, and it's a signaling pathway system, so it keeps our body in station. And there's a signaling pathway between our central nervous system and our immune system. And there's scientists that have come along and discovered deficiencies in this endocannabinoid system, which leads to lots of different ailments, such as tumors, Alzheimer's, epilepsy, cancer. There's a plethora of things. And if you look at it like a signaling system or a communication system that has plaque in some of the switchboards and we can't communicate, cannabinoids can be used to clean up that communication between different types of systems in our body. And so anytime you go down that path, most people are studying CB1 and CB2 receptors, but there's really 31 receptors that have been discovered. If you think of this, from a perspective of certain combinations, I'm a chess player and a guitar player. So in music, there's 12 chromatic notes, which make up most of all the music on the planet. It's about how you play them, when you play them, and when you don't play them, which makes the music and in what rhythm. And same thing with chess. There's almost an infinite amount of moves that you can make against your opponent, and vice versa. And so with these cannabinoids and these receptors, I feel like it's fairly untapped, and there's tremendous amount of potential, especially in a novel way, to find combinations that haven't been discovered yet because people aren't even looking there.
Right.
Yet. They're not. There's 100 compounds in this plant. There's 31 receptors. Think about all the possible combinations between those hundreds of compounds in the plant and these receptors. So there's an infinite library of undiscovered things that are out there, and how we get to them, those methods of extraction and how we put them together. I found it. I mean, I feel like I probably have another 20 discoveries.
Yeah, absolutely. No, and it sounds like I mean, just as you explained, it's just like the opportunity in cracking that nut, and it's like huge data problem, right? Or a data challenge. I don't want to frame it as a problem. It's just a challenge and an opportunity.
It's even an opportunity for the software people, right? Like being able to take what's in my head and work with someone that can track the data points of, let's say, the actual compounds and the actual ailments, even through clinical trials. I mean, just the technology to link that together and to be able to pull data. I mean, that's completely untapped. And some people aren't probably even remotely thinking about it, but these are things that I think of all the time. So again, those are solutions, right? Like we've got a problem. How do we get to the solution? And I think it's exciting times because we talk about product, and we talk about formulations, and we talk about methods of use. That's an exciting topic and chapters to talk about, and how we get there is the extraction method, right? So and it's important because how we get to those products is important for sustainability. It's important for business models. It's important for all kinds of people that are in the industry and companies that are in the industry, and just looking at what they know. And remember, like, what you know today isn't the future.
Exactly.
And so just like anything else, right? Remember when it was like weird to recycle? People didn't want to recycle.
Exactly.
Like people like looked at you weird when you like used to like, oh, do you have a recycling bin? And you're like, I lived on the East Coast and the West Coast, and I could tell you that like the two different coasts are different in that way. And back, from the 90s on forward, it was like a really funny thing. I'd be like, oh, where's your recycling bin? And they're like, recycling bin.
Right? Yep. Exactly.
Now it's like, check out my backpack, my pen, and the paper that I'm using, and the toilet paper, and oh, this computer is made from recycled parts. And now it's like, same thing with hemp. When I think Mercedes is like 17% of the Mercedes on the road has hemp components, whether they're plastic or wires, and I think that when I look at like companies like Tesla and what they're innovating, and other companies where it's at from like 10, 15 years ago to where it is today, we as a society have subscribed more so to sustainability practices, from how the products are made to how they're packaged to now how they're recycled. And I can tell you that we are always looking at that, and it's the future of where I'm headed, and I think anything with Blue River moving forward, how do we create hemp-based packaging, ink that makes sense, devices that make sense. And I feel like the cannabis industry as a whole is really behind
Mm-hmm.
that. I'm guilty of it in some of the devices and things that are currently being used, but it doesn't mean we can't put a pin on the future with a goal of getting that, you know.
Absolutely. And I think that, Tony, that kind of brings me to my last question, which is, yeah, where do you see that future going? I think both in terms of extraction and obviously the implications for sustainability.
So I think that we're going to have a hybrid world. I think you're going to find that there will be a handful of, one or two or possibly three types of mechanical extraction methods that are used for consumables that for inhalation. I think that consumers, as they get more educated, they're going to want products that they put in their lungs to be as clean and natural and unadulterated as
Mm-hmm.
possible. And but that doesn't mean that the rest of the other extractions that I said are going to go disappear, because there are reasons for that. And when you can learn to recover your solvents, which there are companies that do, and so I'm not trying to take that away from different people's extraction methods. And even with butane, they have full recovery systems. So if you're recovering your solvent, that's a step in the right direction. And if you are able to produce high yielding oils that can be used in topicals and digestibles that don't have any trace elements of heavy metals or
Mm-hmm.
solvents, from a molecular standpoint, as an extractor, you've done your
Mm-hmm.
job. You're able to recover your solvent. You're able to produce a product that doesn't have any heavy metals or residual solvents. And I feel in the future, it's going to cover all of the edibles, topicals, um, things like that. But things that are people are looking for, an authentic cannabis experience, a full spectrum, strain specific experience, whether it's in a sublingual drop or a water soluble type of powder or capsule or beverage or something we put into our lung. There's gonna be a large cannabis audience that demands it, not even desires it, but demands it. As they get educated, um, these two categories will these two types of extraction platforms will you know take those categories and fulfill the needs of what people want.
Tony, I guess talking to you has made just made me think about the future of this industry being just incredibly exciting and full of possibilities. I mean, from anywhere from cultivation and the methods that are using data, and like you said, leveraging data to extraction. So, this has been such a fantastic conversation and just incredibly interesting. And just thank you so much for your time.
Yeah, no, I appreciate it. I always like talking about this stuff. So anytime you want to do another round, we could go deeper down the rabbit hole.
That'd be fantastic, and I might just take you up on that. All right, Tony, thank you again. Again, this has been the Sustainable Cannabis Coalition podcast with Tony Verzura from Blue River. Thank you all for listening, and stay tuned for the next episode. We hope you enjoyed this episode of the Sustainable Cannabis Coalition podcast. If you like what you heard, tune into our next episode And make sure to check out our content on our website at sustainablecannabiscoalition.com, and make sure to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and LinkedIn. Yep, we're pretty much everywhere. Till next time.